Anyone who has ever taken part in a friendly grappling contest with a pal, sibling, parent, milkman can all attest to one simple fact: being slammed sucks. Now, imagine being ragdolled by someone who had been specially trained to an Olympic standard in some cases to efficiently cause as much damage as possible via said slam. The art of transforming a fighter's body into a test dummy is an underappreciated one, but we're going to celebrate said art today. I'm Gareth from WhatCulture Combat. Get your crash mats ready because here are the 10 most frightening slams in UFC history. Number 10, Jon Jones vs Stephan Bonnar. In his UFC 94 bout with Stephan Bonnar, a young Jon Jones was in peak form and showcased some of his now signature maneuvers. Spinning elbows and brutal knees to the head demonstrated what he could bring to the striking department, but it was his wrestling ability which really caught the eye. Making Bonnar look like he was in the wrong sport for the entire 3-round fight, Jones threw his opponent around the octagon at his own will. But the sweetest slam of the night came when Jones had Bonnar's back whilst the two were still stood in the center of the cage. Giving Bonnar no time to react, Jones flipped his hips and executed a German suplex straight out of a How to Successfully Pulverize My Opponent handbook. Remarkably, Bonnar managed to make it out of the fight in one piece, but those slams were a thing of sickening beauty. Number 9, Dan Severn vs Anthony Macias. Speaking of German suplexes, one man who was particularly fond of them was two-time NWA World Champion and former WWF employee Dan Severn. Boasting supreme judo and freestyle wrestling skills, Severn did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, to his opponent inside of the octagon. Within reason. If you ever needed an example of this dominance inside of the cage, then look no further than his mauling of Anthony Macias at UFC 4, which was his first ever bout as a professional mixed martial artist. Gluing himself to Macias's back, Severn pulled off not one, but two picture-perfect German suplexes, which must have caused Macias to forget where he was. Those body-shattering slams laid the foundations for Severn to tap out Macias inside of the first 2 minutes of his inaugural MMA clash. And to be honest, I'm thinking about tapping out just talking about it. Number 8, Frank Shamrock vs Igor Zinov. Former number 1 ranked pound-for-pound MMA star Frank Shamrock was a fighter who could seemingly do it all. A high degree of skill in kickboxing and Jeet Kune Do was clear in his style, yet it was his legendary pancrase shoot wrestling which helped separate him from the pack. This epic ability to completely bully an opponent by contorting their limbs or lifting and slamming them on the mat was never more prevalent than in his quick smashing of Igor Zinoviev at UFC 16. Evading Zinoviev's attempts to land some offense early on, Shamrock saw an opening and latched onto his rival. Driving upwards, Zinoviev had no choice but to accept his fate. He was coming back down to earth, and he was coming down hard. As expected, Shamrock brought him down with a monumental thud and knocked the Russian clean out for the count. Number 7, Gerald Harris vs Dave Branch. As with our last entry, there's just something very shocking about seeing someone slammed into the state of unconsciousness inside of the octagon. And if you thought Frank Shamrock's knockout body drop was sickening, my god does Gerald Harris have some news for you. The Ultimate Fighter 7 alumni cemented himself in body slamming history when he decided to use Dave Branch's back to make a powerful statement. Coming off of 2 TKO victories in a row, Harris was expected to pummel Branch to smithereens in this matchup at UFC 116. Branch still ended up in smithereens, just not quite in the way we expected. With Branch clinging onto Harris like a koala would a tree, Harris readied himself and then sharply rocketed his opponent back first into the canvas midway through the 3rd round. Branch's body seized up upon impact and left fans wondering how the hell things had gone so south so quickly for the promising and at this point undefeated fighter. Number 6, Quinton Jackson vs Ricardo Arona. I may be cheating a little bit with this next entry, but Pride was bought out by Zuffa in 2007, so this fight now technically sits under the UFC banner. Well, it does in terms of this list because it's too frightening to leave out. Anyway, Quinton Rampage Jackson was truly dominant in Pride and had already proven just how devastating his body slams could be when he beat Masaki Satake via slam at Pride 20 in 2002. But it was in 2004 when Jackson highlighted just how freakish his raw power could really be. 7.5 minutes into a grueling battle between himself and Ricardo Arona at Pride Critical Countdown, Jackson was dangerously close to being locked in a triangle. However, instead of panicking and flailing around like a madman, like I would do, Jackson found his feet and heaved Arona up into the air before blasting him back down to the ground. Arona was out cold, and Jackson had reminded us all again why it paid to be powerful. Number 5, Matt Hughes versus Carlos Newton. Matt Hughes had dabbled in the octagon a few times over the years, but UFC 34 marked the first fight of his dominant 10-year stint as a full-time UFC employee, and he definitely started as he meant to go on. Taking on Carlos Newton for the welterweight title, everyone was expecting the NCAA Division I All-American to pull off one of his trademark slams in the championship fight. They were right to. But Newton was no slouch, and Hughes taking him to the ground could have easily led to the champ successfully tapping out the challenger, as he'd done so often in the past, so he had to pick his moment. After spending the first round trying to out-grapple one another, Hughes landed his first significant slam of the fight in the second. Then, as Newton threatened to cinch in his signature armbar, Hughes heaved the champion up and rested him on the cage before hammering his rival into the mat, and scoring a sudden KO to become the new welterweight champion. Frightening. Number 4, Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell. These two bona fide UFC legends went to war on multiple occasions during both of their runs as top fighters in the company. They both would manage to score victories over each other, but it was their first ever meeting which brought one of the greatest slams in UFC history into existence. Battling over the interim light heavyweight belt, Randy Couture landed a swift slam on Chuck Liddell early in the fight, a precursor of what was to come. They began the third round by trading significant shots before Liddell eventually found himself being speared into the cage. The Iceman would then finally get definitively dumped on his back, courtesy of the amateur wrestling specialist. Liddell was rocked and couldn't defend himself against the bombardment of shots which followed the slam. Couture was eventually, after an uncomfortably long period of ground and pound had taken place, dragged away for the win, and this epic slam had earned him the opening to score the first win of this monumental UFC feud. Number 3, Tito Ortiz versus Evan Tanner. Speaking of UFC legends, we now make our way to a slam straight out of Tito Ortiz's highlight reel of insane knockout victories. Reigning as the UFC light heavyweight champion, Ortiz took on Evan Tanner in what would be the challenger's fourth fight in the company. Ortiz had won fights in a variety of impressive ways in the lead up to this title fight, but nobody could have predicted quite how this one was going to end. Taking half a minute to dispatch his opponent, Ortiz wrapped his arms around Tanner, hoisted him up and drilled him into the center of the octagon. Tanner's body froze and the ref had no choice but to pull Ortiz off of the broken man for the victory. Number 2, Rustam Kavalov versus Vince Pichel. German suplexes have cropped up a few times on this list, and it's not hard to see why. They look majestic, of course, but they also require a level of technique which takes years to master, and when pulled off effectively, the consequences of the slam can be catastrophic for the unfortunate soul on the receiving end of it. Vince Pichel can attest to those very same consequences, as he was yet another victim of the hyper-athletic maneuver in the final of the Ultimate Fighter 16. Rustam Kavalov had made a career out of mauling people before he even stepped foot inside of the octagon, so he definitely knew he was capable of physically dominating anyone he came up against inside of the cage. Punishing Pichel on the ground for most of the first round, Kavalov finally allowed his adversary to get to his feet, only to execute a beautiful German without letting go of Pichel once. But Pichel was still in it. Then Kavalov did the same thing again, only for Pichel to scramble free from his grasp. Then, just when you thought there wasn't a slam powerful enough to put away such a resilient fighter, Kavalov hurled Pichel backwards, hanging in midair for what felt like an eternity one final time, and pounded Pichel into submission. So close. Number 1, Daniel Cormier versus Alexander Gustafsson. There's no better way to end a list of the most frightening slams in UFC history than with a fighter famed for being an Olympic caliber wrestler. Now, admittedly, other slams on this list may be deemed as more spectacular due to the fact that they were responsible for the end of a fight, which is a valid argument. But Daniel Cormier's Herculean slamming of the larger-than-life Alexander Gustafsson deserves to be lauded simply because of how unlikely the manhandling was, in theory. Sure, DC was a high-class wrestler, but Gustafsson was no slouch either and possessed the ability to defend and take down DC himself if he so wished. So the sight of Gustafsson being hoisted into the air flipped upside down and subsequently nailed into the mat was quite simply astonishing to behold. Not every slam has to completely murder your opponent in order to be labelled as frightening. Sometimes the sight of a 5'11" machine upending a 6'5" tree of a human being is enough to leave your jaw tapping on the floor. And that is our list. What other slams do you think could have made it onto this illustrious list? Let me know all about them in the comment section below, and do not forget to like, share, and click on that subscribe button. I have been Gareth from WhatCulture Combat. Thank you very, very much for tuning in and watching us today, and I'm sure I'm going to see you very, very soon.